Hi, just a quick intro into this 50-minute discussion Dee Dee River and myself have on an article that where Judith Butler, who wrote Gender Trouble about 30 years ago, she's being interviewed and on the Statesman, and we thought it might be interesting to discuss some of her answers. And you can find a part 1 and part 2. Part 1 is about 30 minutes long and part 2 is about 45 minutes, something like that. So I hope you'll join us for part 1 and part 2. Thanks for watching. Hi friends, so I have Dee Dee River here and we're going to discuss Judith Butler on the culture wars, K Rowling, and living in, quote, anti-intellectual times, end quote. And that's in the newstatesman.com and it's by Alona Ferber. So I'll read a little bit of this and then Dee Dee River's going to make some commentary on it. So 30 years ago, the philosopher Judith Butler, now 64, published a book that revolutionized popular attitudes on gender. Gender Trouble, the work she is perhaps best known for, introduced ideas of gender as performance. If asked how we define, quote, the category of women, end quote, and as a consequence, who it is that feminism purports to fight for, today is a foundational text on any gender studies reading list, and its arguments have long crossed over from the academy to popular culture. In the 3 decades since Gender Trouble was published, the world has changed beyond recognition. In 2014, Time declared a, quote, transgender tipping point, end quote. Butler herself has moved on from that earlier work, writing widely on culture and politics, but disagreements over biological essentialism remain, as evidenced by the tensions over trans rights within the feminist movement. How does Butler, who is Maxine Elliott Professor of Comparative Literature at Berkeley, see this debate today? And does she see a way to break the impasse? Butler recently exchanged emails with the New Statesman about this issue. The exchange has been edited. So this is Alona Ferber, and she's asking a question of Judith Butler. She says, in Gender Trouble, you wrote that, quote, contemporary feminist debates over the meaning of gender lead time and time again to a certain sense of trouble, as if the interdeterminacy of gender might eventually culminate in the failure of feminism, end quote. How far do ideas you explored in that book 30 years ago help explain how the trans rights debate has moved into mainstream culture and politics? And Judith Butler says, I want to first question whether trans exclusionary feminists are really the same as mainstream feminists. If you are right to identify the one with the other, then a feminist position opposing transphobia is a marginal position. I think this may be wrong. My wager is that most feminists support trans rights and oppose all forms of transphobia. So I find it worrisome that suddenly the trans exclusionary radical feminist position is understood as commonly accepted or even mainstream. I think it is actually a fringe movement that is seeking to speak in the name of mainstream, and that our responsibility is to refuse to let that happen. So what would you say to that, Dee Dee?
Okay, I think Alona Ferber in this is basically trying to frame the whole discussion in terms of two positions. One, the transphobic position, which is the feminist position, and the trans accepting position, which she says is modern and progressive and a problem. And what Judith Butler basically said is, that this is a nonsense, that in fact the transphobic people, the trans exclusionary people, are a minor fringe of feminism to the extent that they use feminism at all. And I would say there has been an essentialist part or stream or thread within feminism for quite a long time. But most feminism, I think, tends to be much more about freedom and equality and women's rights and that sort of thing. And that doesn't mean women's rights overriding trans rights and women as a special category. That means eliminating patriarchy. Eliminating patriarchy, has always been the goal of feminism, and almost the definition of feminism, particularly radical feminism, has been the elimination of patriarchy. And that's how radical feminists initially distinguished radical feminism from other kinds of feminism, that other kinds of feminism wanted women's rights, to vote or to work or whatever. And we have to remember that, for example, in Australia, women were forbidden to work in the Commonwealth after they were married, until 1976, when it was changed. And that's a ridiculous thing. I mean, how could... So women were fighting against that, but radical feminists were the ones who say, no, patriarchy has to be just gotten rid of altogether.
Sure.
And the trans exclusionary people, that doesn't seem to be their objective. The fact that they work so closely with so many patriarchal groups like the Catholic Church or other Christian groups and conservative groups should make it clear to people.
Yeah.
And Butler here is basically saying clearly that associating the transphobic women with feminism is just wrong.
Yeah.
And it disenfranchises most of feminism, and it privileges within the argument a very small group, putting it as equal to the vast majority of women.
Yeah.
Yeah.
AF says, one example of mainstream public discourse on this issue in the UK is the argument about allowing people to self-identify in terms of their gender. In an open letter she published in June, K Rowling articulated the concern that this would, quote, throw open the doors of bathrooms and changing rooms to any man who believes or feels he is a woman, end quote, potentially putting women at risk. I'll just read what Judith Butler said. She said, if we look closely at the example that you characterize as, quote, mainstream, end quote, we can see that a domain of fantasy is at work, one which reflects more about the feminist who has such a fear than any actually existing situation in trans life. The feminist who holds such a view presumes that the penis does define the person and that anyone with a penis would identify as a woman for the purposes of entering such changing rooms and posing a threat to the women inside. It assumes that the penis is the threat, or that any person who has a penis who identifies as a woman is engaging in a base, deceitful, or harmful form of disguise. This is a rich fantasy and one that comes from powerful fears, but it does not describe a social reality. Trans women are often discriminated against in men's bathrooms, and their modes of self-identification are ways of describing a lived reality, one that cannot be captured or regulated by the fantasies brought to bear upon them. The fact that such fantasies pass as public argument is itself cause for worry. So what would you say about that, Dee?
Okay. Well, I think it's very to the point. I think Butler is incredibly concise and
I think that kind of explains.
And very calm. But I think it is a domain of fantasy. And first off, I just want to say, J.K. Rowling couldn't be considered any kind of theorist.
No.
She's a fantasy writer a children's fantasy writer who happens to be transphobic and has a big platform. Her stuff isn't very well articulated or reasoned, and it certainly isn't any kind of theoretical position. But that being said, what Butler is saying here is that this fantasy of the transphobes that people will that trans people will somehow are somehow trans in order to invade women's bathrooms or something like that.
Yeah, really.
Is really a nonsense. Yeah. If you look at, as Butler says, the lived reality of trans people. The lived reality is that trans. I have to just preface here that we are talking about trans people, and this entire discourse is really framed in relation to trans women. Trans men are not really considered. Non-binary people are not really considered. It's like the fear of trans women.
Yeah.
And I'll have to say that trans women, by and large, are generally pretty fearful about using bathrooms when they are transitioning. Yeah. And it's not until they've transitioned and are really comfortable that they are seen as women that they feel comfortable using a woman's restroom. And if they are comfortable being seen as women, that generally means that they are seen as women. And trans women have been using bathrooms for decades. And that's clearly not the threat. I will say here that Butler is sort of talking about, she talks about the reality, the lived reality of trans people. But I think, and this is where a lot of trans people argue back to the transphobic women, that the transphobic women's fantasy is not necessarily about trans people at all. It's more about men who do not identify as women, pretending to identify as women to use a woman's bathroom. And the thing about that is it's another fantasy. It's a different fantasy. And men don't need to use, and this is what trans women often say, or trans people often say, is men don't need any kind of an excuse at all to walk into a woman's restroom. They don't rape women by wearing women's clothes. They don't rape women by pretending to be trans. That doesn't happen. That really absolutely does not happen. And so it's kind of a double fantasy. There's the fantasy that there are these predatory men who are going to use transness somehow for their predation. And outside of Silence of the Lambs and
I don't think there's any evidence of that at all.
There's no evidence at all.
There was a report done, research, that actually does not happen. I mean, I feel it's a disingenuous argument, just like the argument against, the marriage equality thing, where people try and find some sort of poor, so very thinly veiled, either homophobia in the case of marriage equality, or transphobia
in the case of marriage equality too.
So it's just, I just feel the whole thing is incredibly disingenuous. I wish people would just come out, instead of using all these sad little arguments, would just
say we hate trans people.
We hate trans people.
Just going back to this particular paragraph or response to Butler's, she isn't really talking to that fear of and fantasy of transphobes that men will pretend to be trans. She's saying that the lived reality of trans people is that doesn't happen. That trans people basically would do almost anything to avoid attention and trouble. Trans people generally get enough shit that they don't want to put themselves in a position where they might have problems. And the reality, of course, with the whole bathroom nonsense is that the people who tend to get victimized aren't trans people at all, but butch-looking women. Masculine-looking women. And that might be lesbians and so on. And that's where the gender essentialist thing is so stupid. And it falls so into line with all the conservative Christian, culture war nonsense. It's really reinforces all of the gender stuff to such an extent.
I wish people like K Rowling and Joe Rogan and people like that would actually sit down and have a conversation in public with somebody like Judith Butler, and I don't think they'd last probably 10 minutes.
I don't think they'd last.
Anyway, we might wrap it up here, and we'll probably do a part 2 and about this. I just wanted to do the first couple.
One?
Okay, thanks, Dee Dee, for doing that. You're watching Faint Signals from Vega. Till next time.
Okay.
Bye for now.
Bye.